Thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizer to give me the opportunity. Sorry for the background. I could not figure that out because I'm on holiday here, how to set up a nice, beautiful background. Actually, I'm on my summer vacation, but nevertheless, it was a great pleasure to be part of this event. And my topic today, as Judith says, is regarding the use of operational excellence with digital tools. So before I start, I would like to emphasize that my presentation mainly represents, of course, my personal views and is not necessarily the official position of Takeda. Yes, when we talk about digitalization, what do we mean? I mean, if you look at the literature or if you look at LinkedIn or the internet, you find a lot of different things. And sometimes it's very confusing when people talk about digitalization, whether they talk about the same thing. That could be anything around automation, big data or data science, as we say these days, machine learning, industry 4.0, Internet of Things. So it can mean a lot of different things to different people. But I will give you a little bit of a perspective how these things connect for me and bring it in conjunction with operational excellence. Well, why do we even bother with digitalization? Why is this disruptive, as we say these days in a nice term, for the pharmaceutical industry? I think this is not just because we like to use fancy new technical tools. This is actually a must. So unfortunately, healthcare companies are forced for various reasons to really adapt to the new trends and to utilize digitization. There are various reasons for that. Obviously, there is always a cost pressure. So more and more healthcare systems want to push down drug prices. And for that reason, the pharmaceutical industry has to become more efficient when it comes down to developing and manufacturing new drugs. But there are also other threats, for example, new players coming into the market. If we think about distribution, or if we think about just web applications or apps really for the to interact with the patients, there are some companies that have an expertise in that, and obviously therefore add competition to some aspects of our market. And that this is also important can be recognized by the fact that also the regulatory authorities look into this and try to define some guidelines, some guiding principles for the use of artificial intelligence, like the FDA does here. So this is, of course, mainly focused on medical apps, not so much related to manufacturing, but nevertheless, this was just an example how this becomes also more and more relevant for the agenda of the regulatory authorities. So what I would like to talk about here is to give you a little bit of a context why digitalization is important for operational excellence, how this links to the cost improvements and quality improvements we make via Lean and Six Sigma. And then I would like to show you some digitalization trends of the industry and give you some examples how digital tools can be used to improve productivity. And at the end, I would like to say a few words about data or data science. Okay, so I said already at the start a few general words why we have to be interested in digitalization. And when it comes to manufacturing in particular, there's, of course, even more driver, because the pharmaceutical industry as a whole is not necessarily famous for the cost competitiveness. So this has, of course, improved, I want to say, since 2007, when Janet Woodcock made the statement. But I think generally it's still probably true to say that we overall as an industry produce a relatively high amount of waste, and that we produce good quality, but to relatively significant costs, and struggle sometimes with the scale up. And obviously there's room for improvement. And if you think about other industries like food and consumer care that have much lower margins, earning margins, they are, of course, more advanced in these fields. And there are a lot of things we can learn also with respect to digitalization. Well, how do we typically reduce costs or increase productivity? Well, we look at our main cost factors, so that when we talk about the manufacturing operations, that could be the production labor, non-production labor, or generally labor. So production labor would be, for example, the staff that is directly related to the manufacturing of a product. Non-production would be typically quality. And then non-labor cost would be things like consumables and so on. And if we look at all these cost elements, we can typically Pareto them. So we put them into a Pareto chart to see where we have the most significant contributions and therefore the most significant potentials to potentially save costs. And that will change, obviously, depending on your local setting, on your country, on your location, and the way your company operates, what you produce, and so on. So there's not one fit at all, but it's always worth to have a look at this Pareto to see where are the biggest opportunities to increase productivity. And another thing to take into consideration is, of course, that different sites have different missions. So it's not easy to compare a site that manufactures high volumes of one single product with the site that is like a launch site with producing a lot of different products, but in very small quantities and being focused on changeovers. So they need to have fast, constant changeovers. So here the target of productivity improvements would be quite different. And for that, we typically or classically use Lean and Six Sigma tools. So they have a wide variety of tools that have been developed over the last 100 years in these different aspects. And typically, we use Lean to reduce waste and Six Sigma to reduce variation. And now the question is, how does digitalization fit into this? What can we learn from digitalization for our productivity? But before I go into some examples, I would like to show you some trends of the pharmaceutical industry, how digitalization is done. The first thing is a general slide that I adapted from Quantum Black that is looking at different aspects of the manufacturing business that can potentially be automated. And when we talk automation, digitalization, there is, of course, a strong relationship because, yes, automation is around since many, many decades. But of course, these days, it's very difficult to do automate without having a digital concept in mind. So automation and digitalization go hand in hand these days. And the authors here had recognized or had actually estimated that we could about 60% of our tasks automate. And that's, you could argue about the number. Is it more? Is it less? But certainly is a very significant number and shows there's a huge opportunity compared to what we are currently doing in different fields. And that's not just process automations. This could be also things like business data, for example, business processes using RPAs and so on. Then there was a study in 2017 where people were asked in our industry, where do you feel is your organization in terms of digitalization? How advanced is your organization? And this was actually compared with other industries as well. So the interesting part here is that when it comes to like a medium levels of digitalization or digital maturity, we are actually not so far behind the other industries. But when it comes to more advanced or more mature digitalization, then there is still a significant gap, at least at the time of the study, to other industries. And then another question was from another study in 2020 or in 2017, looking forward at 2020, what would be the most exciting digitalization opportunities? And not very surprisingly, I think here it is reflected that Internet of Things or Internet of Industry or technology, as people sometimes call it these days, is probably the winner. And I think these things are, of course, difficult to separate. Of course, all these things play into each other. But I think what what is nicely shown here, what is reflected in here, is that we have more and more a connection of everything, that we have more and more need to look into the overall digitalization, not just individual aspect, not just individual tools or individual equipments. We need to look into the connectivity of everything, and I will come to that, back to that later. Then another question that was asked was, how is digital transformation taking place? And what I find interesting here is that the majority is actually focusing on centrally managed projects. And that again shows that digital typically needs a good strategy. Of course, you can do digitalization, you can bring in some tools, some vendors, some bits and pieces into your department. But if any other department is not connected or is not doing the same thing, or doing it with the same speed, you usually struggle to maximize the benefits for your organization, because your benefits will be very limited. So the big benefits of digitalization come when you look at it from a holistic point of view. And therefore, it's not very surprising that when you were asking people, what are your expectations in terms of improvements based on digitalization, the majority is thinking that we should see an improvement in productivity and quality, but even in innovation and collaboration. And then if you put this further in terms of financial measures, of course, if you improve productivity, that means you will have cost reductions, you have hopefully good cases for return of investment, and you generate new revenue opportunities or improved revenue opportunities. Good, so this was the survey. Now I would like to share with you some concrete examples of digitalization and how they can potentially impact productivity. So when it comes to, I think I don't have to say that again, if it comes to operational excellence, we have, of course, a huge opportunity in terms of optimizing processes and therefore making them more productive. We can use RPAs like bots, I have mentioned already. We can use AR, VR. There is intelligent maintenance or predictive maintenance, blockchain applications in supply chain. So possibilities are really endless, but let me pick a few concrete examples for you. So for the first one, I wanted to explain a little bit about how to use virtual reality for operators. So what we have done here, and I have also seen other companies doing that, is to use virtual reality in a virtual reality environment. Excuse me, just 1 second here. In a virtual reality environment, you obviously can simulate the environment you are working in, and that means you can reproduce, for example, lab or a manufacturing environment or whatever else you would simulate in an artificial virtual environment. And that is quite useful for training, because if you think that normally the operators would have to be trained on a line, that means you would block the line, you would block also very experienced people to train them, you would need consumables and so on. So the idea here is that you could do a majority of these training cycles already, at least the early training cycles, you could do already in a virtual environment, and then would only do the final training cycles at the shop floor. And then I think savings or productivity increases are obvious. You can put your experienced operators on the process. You can save some consumables that can be very significant when you deal with biologics or cell and gene therapy. And of course, the operators are allowed to make as many runs and many mistakes as they want. Another example is augmented reality. In augmented reality is similar. It's just not a full virtual environment. It's actually an overlay between a virtual environment and the reality, the real world that you're looking at. And that can be also very beneficial. So for example, if you could think about that, the operator would see in the glasses the instructions for the batch record. So then the operator could work hands-free, for example, in a biosafety cabinet. That can be very handy for very manual processes, as we have it quite often in cell therapy still. Another example is maintenance, where the maintenance expert engineer would basically have the maintenance instructions in the smart glasses, and then could operate hands-free on the machine. He could even receive instructions from a person like via video link that is from the supplier of the equipment. So again, you can imagine there are big productivity improvements because working becomes much more efficient. You make less mistakes. You can even potentially save travel costs and many other things. Another thing that goes with VR and AR is voice-controlled batch records. I mentioned already when I was talking about using AR for batch records that you could work hands-free, and if you combine this with voice-controlled batch records, the operator could even dictate to the system the findings. When he reads values, he could basically say it into a microphone, and it would be recorded by the system and then put all together. So all these sort of softwares are available also for pharmaceutical applications. Obviously, there are strict requirements for pharmaceutical applications, not only with respect to GMP use of tablets and so on and of equipment, but also when it comes to software. We think about CFR 21 Part 11 and so on. But there are a lot of good commercial softwares and tools out there that have these compliance for pharmaceutical requirements that could be used. Another more advanced thing we have not used yet, but which could potentially also be something that the industry would use in the future, is cognitive cameras. So you can imagine, again, if you have a very manual process here in this little example that's shown by a workshop, but it could also work with a lab or with a manufacturing environment, you would basically look with a camera at the process. So the camera would record the process the operator or the technician is doing, and then this is connected to or linked with an artificial intelligence. So basically, the camera this way would learn from the best operators what is the right process, what are the right steps, and this would be documented as a kind of standard process. And then if somebody is doing, again, the process, and the camera system would see a deviation from this process. For example, instead of doing first, you grab tool A and then tool B, and you would do it the other way around, the camera would give an error message to the MES system or to a control room and basically records this. This is, of course, a very useful thing because, as you all probably know, for manual process, sometimes very difficult to investigate deviations or even to open proper deviations because you do not have proper records of what has been done. And this is a potential way of doing this in a very efficient way. Now, there are obviously legal boundaries that are very country specific. It's not possible to put video cameras in some countries that easily, but if you think about, there are ways to comply, of course, with that. These cognitive cameras is not the same as video surveillance, of course, so there are definitely room for using it in a right and compliant way. Good. So after showing some examples, I would like to talk a little bit about data. And when we talk about data or big data, typically we have opportunities in the field of data collection, data visualization, data mining, forecasting, and modeling. And what we need for that is, of course, we cannot just go to a system and say, okay, we want to do data mining and data modeling or even predictive data science. Of course, there's some system requirements for that. So typically, you need to have electronic systems in place, for example, e-batch records or even MES. Not every electronic system is necessarily suitable for that. So you need to have the right systems in place for what you want to do. And then you can take all your systems and put them into data lakes to fully leverage this data. Another very important aspect is that you should not mix up data science with IT necessarily. IT typically in most organizations is responsible for the infrastructure, but they are not necessarily always the right people where you can expect to construct the business cases when it comes to connectivity, identifying the right data. And for that, for example, Takeda has a separate digital and data science organization in manufacturing. I mentioned the data lake already. Data lakes are quite important to fully leverage the connectivity, really to put everything together in the end that we would like to analyze and also monitor and potentially improve. And the data lake is essentially a system where you put the data from all your different sources. Typical sources would be like MES, Historian, SAP, LIMS, and so on. And that would then allow you to do a lot of data analysis, but potentially even use the learnings from that. If you combine that with artificial intelligence, you could do it even in an automated way to constantly improve your process. And that is pretty much what I said already. It's about really monitoring, understanding, but then potentially even correcting and improving the process. Yeah, and when it comes to forecasting and modeling, there are a lot of tools out there that are not necessarily that new. For example, design of experience, multivariate data analysis, and then combining this with process analytical technology and so on. This is not new that we have done already 20 years ago, but I guess the new opportunities here are really the sort of data access we have to get data from all these different systems, to have this connectivity between all the systems via the data lakes. I would like to finish, just saying or summarizing really that we have a lot of opportunities for digital data science in our industry and manufacturing in particular. And this, of course, can be used very nicely to improve our productivity further. And that starts really with our patients that would like their products, their medicines in the best quality for a good price. And that goes on to demand and supply, where we can optimize our supply chain. We can automate our warehouses. We can do a lot of improvements on the shop floors. And I have mentioned a few examples here today. We can collect and monitor data. We can use this data then also to analyze and improve, and even have, when we have all these things well digitalized and well connected, we could even have advanced things like automatic release, review by exceptions. For example, here that you only need to look at the quality batch records in case there is a flag coming up by the system, and otherwise it would be automatically released, which would again accelerate the production of our medicines to the benefit of our patients and customers. Okay, so I hope I could show you today that digitalization is a disruptive process for the pharmaceutical industry, but at the same time also an enormous opportunity, especially if we think about the manufacturing area, where we can improve by combining with classical productivity improvements with Lean and Six Sigma. We can improve quality, efficiency, and decrease costs significantly. It's not just an opportunity for our core manufacturing processes, but also for the surrounding business processes. If we think about RPA, we can do much better simplification and less laborious admin processes. And finally, I wanted to emphasize that this all requires, of course, not just tools, but it also requires a mindset shift. While the manufacturing departments or manufacturing businesses have seen themselves mainly as like executor and not being very innovative. I think here to fully utilize our digital tools, we should embrace innovation and really use these tools to innovate within the framework of manufacturing to achieve continuous improvement, not only in terms of our tools, but also in terms of the culture. I would like to close with this quote from Albert Einstein, who said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So I guess digitalization is a way to do things different and then expect different results. Thank you very much for your attention.